All right, and then we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you. Welcome. Thank you so much. What an amazing crowd. This is our last of our summer lecture series focused on the MDI maritime history. If we haven't had a chance to meet, my name is Raney. I'm the executive director for the Mount Desert Island Historical Society, and we are super excited to be here again at the Northeast Harbor Library and are so grateful for their hospitality for this series this summer. And this is also offered in partnership with the Great Harbor Maritime Museum. If you're not a member of the MDI Historical Society, you might not know that every year we produce a journal called Chibako, which focuses on 13 or 14 different articles of local island scholarship. And this year's edition was focused on maritime history, done in partnership with the Maritime Museum. And our lecture series this summer has been focused on those articles that were produced as part of this edition. But I'm really excited because tonight's lecture is a little bit different. We did not have an article in Chibako on this theme, and it was something that it was a really new opportunity to bring in a fresh new voice, looking at some fresh new history, which is really what the MDI Historical Society is all about. So I'm very excited to be able to add this to our summer lecture series. All of these have been recorded, or many of them, sorry, not all of them, have been recorded, and they'll be available after the fact through the MDI Historical Society's website for free. So please feel free to look at those. And then we'll also have a series of winter programs that will be starting up in October, mostly online. So please keep an eye out for that as well. So tonight we're going to be talking about smuggling, and MDI has a really long history of smuggling that extends much earlier than the rum running that we typically think of as our history. And so what is it that defines smuggling? You have to start with resources. What do they have that we want? And if we can't get it ourselves, can we get it legally through purchase or through trade? If we can't get it legally, how else are we going to get it? If we can get it legally, is it too expensive? And we maybe need to think of other ways that we want to get it. And could we turn around and sell it for a profit? Finally, what are the political constraints to access those things that we need and at affordable prices? So this is a very highly simplified, obviously, kind of an essence of what it would drive somebody to, or entice somebody to go into smuggling. So if we look prior to European contact to Wabanaki people, we have no way of really knowing if there was a cultural or political need for smuggling prior to European contact, but it is possible. There were well-established boundaries between tribal nations. There were powerful political confederacies that united groups of nations under a common set of policies, practices, and laws. And there were highly developed trade routes stretching from Nova Scotia to the mid-Atlantic and into the Midwest. So whether smuggling, as defined above in our simplistic terms, was part of the Wabanaki lived experience is less known. As European political boundaries started to expand into the Northeast, they were established on the eastern seaboard through several different countries, and these borders are somewhat fluid for a period of time. And so smuggling took the place of everything from information to individuals. Jumping forward to 1807, we find some very well-documented attempts to control smuggling here in Frenchman Bay. We have an article about this in Chibako, where Thomas Jefferson enacted an embargo on the District of Maine to avoid a war with Britain in 1807. A customs district was established that stretched between the Union River outside of Ellsworth to Goldsboro Bay on the eastern side of us, and included all the offshore islands. So this was a really vast and complex region to manage. It was managed by one guy in a rowboat, and he was stationed in Ellsworth. So imagine if you're this guy in Ellsworth and you get word that there's a smuggling operation taking place in one of the many little nooks and crannies of our harbors and outer islands, and you got to jump in your rowboat and head out there, likely you've already missed the boat. Common items that were smuggled during this period of time would include gypsum, plaster, flour, and timber. And these smugglers were rarely local. They would have been on large ships, oftentimes armed with cannons, between Nova Scotia and traveling down to Connecticut, New York, or Massachusetts. But we know that there were many locals who were willing to assist in the smuggling operations of these larger ships. Due primarily to economic necessity, at the time, there's very little inland access to the coast, to the resources that you need. So everything that you would need to get is accessible primarily through sea trade. And so with the embargo locking that down, getting necessities here to MDI was very difficult over land. It took a long time and it was very expensive. So smuggling was a way to feed your family and to be able to make ends meet. But also given the shifting political alliances and maritime law at the time, it's totally possible that smugglers locally didn't even know what they were doing was illegal. We have stories of contraband that were being unloaded here on MDI and out on the Cranberry Islands by captains with familiar names, such as Hadlock and Rich. The embargo was ended in 1809, but it was certainly not the end of smuggling in the region. But for the sake of time, we're going to jump forward to Prohibition, our most famous smuggling history. As many people know, alcohol was outlawed in Maine 70 years prior to the national prohibition, so smuggling was very well established here. Series of boats nosing in and out of tiny harbors at night, fast cars with false compartments hidden in them, and speakeasies in the basements of common businesses are part of our island mythology. It's well known that summer residents would ship bottles of wine and booze to the island in advance of their visit to store them with locals until they arrived for their summer season. The long experience with smuggling liquor into Maine gave local rum runners a leg up when national prohibition was passed. Rum runners had already had their networks in place from Canada to the Caribbean, with operators that had vast experiences functioning under the radar. Historian Ralph Stanley says, quote, "The new law had actually made rum running big business. Foreign vessels registered from Canada or the West Indies loaded with liquor, many times would be pure alcohol in 5-gallon tins, would lay just outside the limits of US waters. Many of these were sailing vessels, fishing schooners, and coasting schooners. Boats from onshore would run the liquor back to shore under the cover of darkness and thick fog, and many of these boats were small fishing boats." This history of small fishing boats running smuggled goods to MDI saw a resurgence in the 1970s, as we're going to hear about tonight. So I'm really excited to introduce Audrey Ryan, who is a native to Town Hill here on the island. And she started to learn about this more modern drug smuggling tradition firsthand from her father, who was a fisherman at the time, and was among the locals who were dragging up what was called sea hash in their catches. Intrigued by the stories, Audrey has been researching and writing the Downeast Goldmine since 2011, spending summers here in Maine focused on this project, chasing down elusive fishermen at their boats and in their homes, digging for archival reports and newspaper articles on microfilm and dusty basements, and traveling to sites where the drug smuggling occurred almost 40 years ago. Audrey explores the impact of the intersection of fishing and drug smuggling from all perspectives of the fishermen, the authorities, and the smugglers. Her article, Overboard, the Big Catch, was the cover story of May 7th on the Boston Globe magazine, and she's brought copies for us here tonight. So if you haven't already had one, or if you'd like one, please make sure to pick one up on your way out. Audrey has a master's degree and PhD in counseling psychology and a bachelor's in English. Currently, she is a psychiatric consultant, professor, and writer who lives in Newton, Massachusetts with her husband and 2 children. For those of you on Zoom tonight, please, at the end of the session or throughout the presentation, feel free to put your questions or comments in the chat feature, and we'll share those at the end of the evening. And for those in the audience, if you don't mind holding your questions until the end, she'll be happy to answer them then. So please join me in welcoming Audrey. Thank you.
Well, I learned something. I did not know that alcohol was illegal before prohibition in Maine. Maybe you guys didn't know that. Anyway, so my name is Audrey. I have a bunch of pictures to share first. This one's pretty low quality, but this is me on my dad's boat. Actually, it wasn't his boat. He fished with Raymond Hodgkins. I don't know if anyone knows who that is. And he fished with other people as well. I think he started fishing sometime in the 70s and he ended sometime in the 90s. That's about all I know. I think he did it seasonally mostly, and ironically mostly in the winter, because people scallop in the winter, which sounds very unpleasant to me. So when I was a kid, we lived in Town Hill. He brought home this humongous, you can't really tell for context, that's a big shoe. That lobster is probably like 3 feet long. And he gave it a loafer. And anyway, I do not care for lobsters. I think that was the end, right? Because of that moment right there. Anyway, he used to work at a fish market. This is on West Street, which is now, of course, I don't know, torn down, gone. But that's him. He looks really young and skinny. Anyway, and that's me and him. Man, what a haircut. That's a scallop dragger. The boat he was on was called the Diane K. I believe that was Raymond's boat. And the person he's with is Howdy Houghton. If anyone remembers him, passed away a couple of years ago as a security guard at COA. So my fascination has mostly been with the Tusker, which is the boat that dropped the sea hash. I'm going to go into some other cases as well for context, but the Tusker is the one that I kind of did a deep dive in, if you will. And just so you know, this took me a long time to figure out all this information. So even though I've kind of, here it all is, I've been working on this since 2011, and I probably took me about a year just to, I know this is crazy, but just to get the name of the boat correct, because all the fishermen said the Tusker. And they said it in such a way that there was no R. And it took me like a year to figure out that it was the accent that had eliminated the R. And then once I got the R, then I found all the articles very easily, in fact, once I spelled it correctly. But anyway, the Tusker came to Cutler Harbor, which is a bit of a ways from here, by the way, but by boat, probably less. And they were at Denison Point. Has anyone, I don't know if you guys have been to Cutler, it's beautiful, but it is Washington County. It's very rural. So they basically bought what you call a stash house. And they also had an inland house, which I believe was in Freedom, Maine. That's where they had their radio communications. But this house, I've been to a couple of times now. And the Tusker was, it turns out, was their third operation that they got busted on. And it was busted by the Coast Guard and the DEA. There were 8 crewmen that were convicted. And what we learned, what I learned later on, because it was not in the paper and the Ellsworth American or the Bangor Daily News, is they were part of a cartel. I don't think that the Bangor Daily, I don't think anyone knew that right off the bat. But when I interviewed the DEA, he knew. But it was a very established cartel, and they're from California, which always seemed interesting to me because in these articles, everyone's from California, and then you're like, why are they in Cutler, Maine? But because they were part of a cartel. So they had actually basically been indicted on the West Coast, and then they needed to, you know, keep working. So they came to Cutler, of all places. So anyway, this was the third operation. The first 2 were successful, and they got busted. It's really unclear exactly how much hash was on board. Even the smuggler that I've interviewed doesn't remember exactly, probably because there were so many times that they smuggled drugs. But usually the articles are somewhere between 10 and 20 tons, a minimum of 7. But like, you know, a lot of the cases I found were about 20 tons. It's a lot. Hash is, I mean, I'm not a marijuana expert, but hash is different than marijuana. It is much denser, and I think it's harder to kind of come by in a way. But this hash was from Afghanistan. It was in metal canisters. When I was writing the article for the Globe, their fact checking was very serious, and they asked, were the canisters metal or excuse me, they were tin, we know that. Were they cylindrical or like, because some people describe them as like Humpty Dumpty cans, like big, you know, and then other people describe them as like a shoebox, like a big shoebox. So I had to figure that out. It turns out that they were actually more like shoeboxes. I actually thought for the last 12 years that it was cylinders, but anyway, it was intense. And there were about 300 canisters. They weighed about, let's say about 80 pounds or 100 pounds each. They're dense. And when they got caught by the Coast Guard, they scuttled the contraband. And of course, the question you're probably asking is like, how did they get away with this? Well, I interviewed the Coast Guard guy, and they had 2 boats, but this was like 140-foot-ish size tugboat that they were busting. It's a big boat, and the Coast Guard boat was much smaller, and they were in front of the boat, leading it back to port. And while they were doing that, they threw the evidence. So this is the house. This is the stash house in Cutler. It is beautiful. It's a beautiful house. I've met the people that own it now. I believe they live in New Jersey. But they have you can't really see it, but right there, That's the barn part, and they have a huge hearth, I guess, I don't know what you call it, just like, the masonry of like a fireplace, and they call it the smuggler's den. They're very aware of the smuggling history of that house. And there's some crazy stuff that happened in that house, for sure. I think when I spoke to the smuggler, it's a pretty big cliff. I don't think you can tell very well from this picture, but it's an incline, and they were using pickup trucks to go back, up and down with all these drugs. This is the third smuggle, remember? And they would, I don't know what they used exactly. He said plywood, but it's hard for me to imagine this, but they used ramps, and they had a very complicated apparatus that you use for logging that was hooked up to these pickup trucks going up and down with the trucks. And the mothership was like out here, and because it gets shallow, right? And then they have Zodiacs that would go back and forth with the well thought out. But they got busted. This was in the Bangor Daily News, found this article the minute I got the Tusker name correct. They found 500 pounds, like they did get some of the evidence, which is how they were able to convict them. And they need something. And then this picture is not great, but this is Jerry Samuel. He was the, I don't know what he called it. He was the captain of the tugboat. And this one here, who was like the weird thing, I'm pretty sure this is Lee Strimple, because he's very tall, and he's the one that I've interviewed. Some of these guys are dead now. This did happen in 1978. I think Sam's was definitely dead, but from my understanding, only like some of them are the Coronado Company, and the rest of them were hired, for a lot of money to go take this tugboat to Afghanistan, or I guess Pakistan, wherever they would get the hash, and then go over the Horn, because Panama Canal is too conspicuous, apparently, all the way over the Horn, and they were supposed to take 50 days to get there. Unfortunately, they showed up 2 days early. They showed up on the 48th day instead of the 50th, and they just sat there. And that was enough time for the Coast Guard to be like, for people to be like, why is there a humongous tugboat sitting in the middle of this little Machias Bay? So they kind of messed up. Anyway, once I found out the name of the boat, plenty of articles. The Quaddy Times, I don't even think that exists anymore, this paper, but they had a thing about it, that Cutler was the scene of the smuggling operation. They did plead innocent. They had one lawyer out of Bangor who's quite infamous for dealing with drug cases. His name was Marshall Stern. I think he passed away, but he's in a lot of cases. It was also in the national paper. I mean, it got out there. This was definitely in the news a lot of places. They, of course, made bail. They had plenty of money somewhere. So they got out and took it to court. So when this says agents held suspicion before hashish arrests, when I interviewed the smuggler, they knew that the house was hot, and they tried to get out of the house. They did their best to kind of get out before the bust. It just didn't work out because the radio and telecommunications between them and the boat were not going well, because apparently, it was December, it was cold, and I think they'd had some mechanical issues on their way there, and one of their antenna had frozen and fallen off. So they weren't able to communicate with the boat. So they just had a lot of mishaps that kind of made them exposed. But it turns out that the house was also right down the road from a Maine Marine Patrol person. Oops. And he noticed that there was out-of-state plates, and, some people wearing probably nice clothes and looking very out of state. So that didn't go well. Anyway, once the boat was seized, it ended up in Southwest Harbor, because there was a Coast Guard station there. I don't think there is anymore. I don't know if there still is. Okay, well, I guess. Anyway, that's where it ended up. One funny side story is one of the fishermen that I interviewed sieved gas out of it. So he'd pull up his fishing boat and just, I don't know how to use a sieve to get it, so you just take the gas. It was probably a lot of gas in it, because it was a very large boat. But it was sitting there for quite a while until they auctioned it off. And for not a lot of money, quite frankly. I think it went for pretty cheap. It was can't remember. It was also in the paper, all the deals that went, but I think in the end, some Canadian firm bought it. Anyway, I'd say in 2014, so this is 3 years into my research, I interview the DEA guy, the one who busted the case, and he's the one that told me that it was the Coronado Company. I did not know that before. These guys were basically already famous in California. them coming to Maine was basically their unraveling, even though they'd already been indicted on the West Coast. It's a fascinating story. If you're into this, I totally recommend, there's a 60-minute thing on them from the 80s. It's hilarious. So if you want to check it out. But anyway, Josh Behrman is a writer from Los Angeles. I've become friends with him because we both are interested in the story. He's interested in the Coronado Company. I'm interested in Maine and fishermen. But he published this article in GQ magazine, I probably 2013-ish, somewhere around there. He also wrote the story Argo. If you guys have watched that movie, that's him. He's a very great writer. But anyway, he has been fascinated with this story, and he knew quite a bit. Not too much about Maine, but he did know a lot about the story in general. And he did mention it in his story. Oh, the Shell Company. So I do want to note this. See how it says Ocean Survey and Studies? I'm going to tell you about a different case in a little bit, and just remember that that's their front name, is Ocean Survey Studies. And when it said Tusker left Pakistan, someone asked me about this. I think I'm going to sound like a moron right now, but I think Pakistan's on the coast and Afghanistan end. Is that correct? So even if the hash was from Afghanistan, it still had to get to Pakistan to get on the boat. If that makes sense. So, it was also in the New York Times, the Coronado Company. Yeah. So it made it that far. This is the kingpin of the Coronado Company. And why this story is so great, actually, at least the Coronado Company part of it, is that this cartel formed in Coronado. Is anyone know Coronado's like kind of right off of San Diego? Is that island that you have to kind of drive onto? And I've become good friends with Lee Strimple, one of the smugglers, and this was his Spanish teacher. So basically, it was the 60s. These guys surfed, they got stoned. Mexico was, you could see it. And they started going to Mexico, probably Tijuana, whatever's right there, getting weed and swimming it up the coast. And they would put it in like garbage bags and tie it to their feet or whatever. They were good swimmers. I think some of them were on the swim club. That was how this cartel started. But it quickly became more advanced, and they used boats, mostly Zodiacs. There's a lot of Zodiac boats drug dealing, I think. So they would, go take a boat up and down, very close, right, from San Diego down there. And then at one point, they realized their Spanish wasn't any good, so they got their Spanish teacher involved. And so I'm totally serious. And so then he basically became their translator, and then he became the kingpin, because he turned out to be quite ruthless. So that's him with the sunglasses. And then these are these swimmers, right, in the high school. And then this is them on top of their bales of weight. And I don't know why he's in that, because that's just, I don't know, but it's hilarious. But those are the pictures in the GQ article, I believe. His name is Lou Villar. He's still alive. I think he's probably in his 80s now. And last I heard, he's like a pickleball champion. We haven't talked to him, but that's what I heard. Anyway, so this is, you guys remember that guy was Mike Wallace? Is that his name? Yeah. So he was the one, that's why I'm saying if you want to look it up, in 1985, they did a 60 Minutes thing called the Coronado Mob. Of course, the guy I interviewed does not like being called the mob. He also doesn't like being called cartel either. I think they're much more peace and love, no guns, just weed kind of thing. But you're still smuggling drugs. So, but I think it was Mike Wallace on that boat, went up and down with one of the dealers or one of the smugglers, and they showed him the boat route and everything. This is Lee Strimple, who I interviewed when he was much younger. This is him much younger, almost 40 years ago. And he was indicted and served some time in whatever California jail after everything went down. But they did the 60 Minutes episode, which of course goes into this much more detail, but I'm not going to go into it because I want to keep on subjects. I'm going to bring you back to Cutler. These are some of the people in Cutler I spoke with. Cynthia Roden, who's kind of like the town gossip. She actually, I guess her grandfather was a rum runner, and she definitely knew about the sea hash. These are some fishermen that live right up the road from the dark house. And they were nice enough to host me in their garage while I interviewed a guy who had been busted for selling the sea hash and had gone to jail. So the irony is that there were people that were busted, couple, for selling sea hash that probably served more time than the smugglers. To give you a sense. Anyway, so the Tusker timeline, as it came into Cutler, the 11th and 12th, it sat there, remember, for 2 days, because it was 2 days early. They got busted on the 13th. They were arraigned. It was auctioned off. Oh, that was the price. Oh, it went from 75,000, maybe, and then it got sold again for 124,000. That's still pretty cheap if you think about it for a humongous tugboat. They were convicted, you know, and sentenced for 1 to 2 years each, and they appealed it. And then scallop season began a year or two later, and it just turned out, coincidentally, that the hash was dropped on what my father called the best scallop beds he'd ever seen. So it was all just a coincidence, quite frankly. So again, that's him back on the scallop dragger. I noticed that one of these pictures, that kind of looks like a scallop dragger to me. I don't know, I'm not a fishing expert, but they're big. They're pretty big boats, they have a big rig. And this is a piece of the hash. My dad did keep that piece. It did have a stamp on it from, I guess, the Providence in Afghanistan called Nazar, or something along those lines. You can kind of see it. See how it says ZAR? It's amazing that it's, like if it was marijuana, it would have just, right? It would have probably just been, especially if it was exposed to the ocean, it would have been toast, but because it was penetrated in oil, it survived. These are the hashish that was confiscated. I don't know if you guys can tell, this is Mike Povich. Does anyone know Mike Povich? He was the DA here for many, many years. Lovely guy, did talk to him. He was hilarious. He knew about the sea hash. That's what he called it, sea hash. And he had convicted some people for it. And he was the person who actually really put into context for me the difference between criminals and outlaws. Or that's how he termed it. And I went through the list of all the people that, you know, had some association. He kind of told me which ones were criminals and which ones were outlaws. Because some of them are repeated offenders versus, I think a lot of fishermen were just outlaws. You know, they don't really care about the law too much, or not much. I mean, maybe they do, but only as much as it suits them or whatever. This gentleman here at Teddy Bridges, I did interview, and he is a fisherman. He had, you know, he'd also been busted for like having illegal guns, and you know, there was other stuff going on. But it was a buy bust. There were undercover agents that went and sold him, or sold somebody in this thing. They tried to sell him sea hash, and this also happened to Peter Shaw, who I think I have a picture of, and he bought sea hash from undercover agents. So again, these guys probably had a harder time getting out of it than the smugglers. They probably had less money and less lawyering going on as well. So these are the three. This is the buy bust. And I spoke with Peter Shaw. The sad thing is he was like in college, and it kind of derailed his life to a degree that he got mixed up in that. Yeah, so a big question that I had for years were, did anyone get caught besides the smugglers? That was a big thing I wanted to know, and it turned out the answer was yes. A lot of people didn't get caught though, so. But anyway, the sea hash is definitely, this is another case of whatever. Did anyone see this article in Downeast magazine? Maybe not. I think it was last summer, actually. It wasn't that long ago. It was more about cocaine, quite frankly. But this guy on the right is the one that I interviewed. His name is Michael Cuniff. He is now, I think he still is a lawyer in Portland, but he also is like a professor at USM Law, which is kind of how I got in contact with him, because a friend of mine had gone there for law school and remembered him. But he was the person that pretty much started the drug smuggling task force in Maine. And what's amazing to me is that this guy was in New York City in the DEA, and there was so much activity going on here that they brought him to Maine.
Wow.
In the sense, like there was that much going on that apparently New York City didn't need him as much as we did. And he was the one that came up with profiling. And he's a really smart guy, so his profiling was kind of ingenious. And the profiling was out-of-state people with lots of money, cash money, that want a house on the water that's very private and has a deep dock. You know, and goes to these real estate agents and flashes cash and says, hey, you have this thing. And that's how they busted a lot of people, was by talking to real estate agents. Kind of genius, I thought. Yeah, that article, if you are interested, is in Downeast Magazine. It goes on to the war on drugs. We all know about that, or I do. And yeah, he's the one that started that task force. But it turns out when I interviewed him, he was like, oh, that was just one case, So basically, this is a drop in the bucket. There were a lot of cases going on at this time frame. So I was thinking the Tusker was this sort of like big deal or whatever. And he's like, yeah, that was an interesting one. But the other ones were kind of, there's a lot of other stuff going on. The first one that I found out about before that was oceanic research. And that one is very relevant because it took place in Bass Harbor. And I'll go into that one soon. That was in 1977, June 15th. So that's like a year and change before the Tusker. Then there's one called the Onlay. That was in East Booth Bay Harbor. The Traveler 3, which is fascinating. I'm going to go into that one a little bit. That was in Petite Manane, not too far from here. The Tusker, we've already talked about. The I Forgot was in West Poolsboro. The Sunshine was in Turkey Cove. And then the Jubilee, this one was fascinating, was the Ethiopian Coptic Church. I have a good picture of that one. So this one is relevant because it's on the island. And guess what the name was? Oceanic Research. But I just think it's hilarious. It's a fake business friend. Yes, and I actually, I'll show you a picture later of when I actually saw a picture of it. So they purchased a building, the Underwood Canning Factory in Bass Harbor, right on the water. And they successfully smuggled approximately 80,000 pounds of marijuana without being caught. And there were tractor trailers, they got it in there, the tractor trailers brought it out, and some of the fishermen I spoke to who live around here had gone there, and they said that there were brand new Toyota pickup trucks abandoned and all kinds of chafe weed on the floor. So they just left a crime scene and just went, and they were out of there. And but anyway, everyone knows about it now, but the irony is that the part that was really hilarious is that the Bar Harbor Times was genuinely curious about this business. And they were talking about like, what is this new oceanic research? Will it bring jobs to the area? They really want to, they believe it's a real deal. They're like, what kind of research are they doing? And I think they paid like 50 grand cash or something for the building, something like that. I think they made a lot more. But the irony is like, look at this. All we have been able to find out is that it was from the Grand Cayman Islands. So they didn't see that they were not, they weren't hip to it. Anyway, but this was talked about. I just think it's hilarious that they went that they kind of like were dancing around it. Part of me is like, did they know they didn't want to say it? But they just seemed pretty naive, the paper. But anyway, this is the sign. Which, where was it? Well, I went to see a friend and her dad had somehow acquired it. I walked into the barn and there it was. When I was talking to her about something else, and I was just like, wow, that's hilarious. But that was that, they got fake signs and everything. I mean, they really pulled the wool over our eyes. So that's Harbor. The Onlay, the DEA agent did mention this one. They used an 80-foot yacht, East Booth Bay. They attempted to smuggle 20 tons of marijuana. Again, remember, it's like 20 tons, like these big amounts. 80,000 pounds, how many tons is that? It's a lot. 32 defendants, that's a lot of people. I thought that one was quite a bit. And they got a 2-count indictment. So they found 487 bales of marijuana in the boat. So, the thing is, I found if you go, computers are just so amazing. Just go on there and you can find this is another one that paid high rent for a lease term that included off-season months. This was part of their profiling thing. I think Michael Cunningham was really smart because he was able to find all this stuff just from looking for something similar, like a trend, basically, a pattern. The Traveler 3, this is a really interesting case. I'm still researching this case. I'm kind of not done because I've been speaking to the family of someone associated with this case. But it was a sailboat. It was a 68-foot yacht. It was teak, so it was very pricey and expensive boat. It was pretty beautiful. And they scuttled it off the coast of Petite Manille, right near Jonesport. And it sank to the bottom over 200 feet. They never recovered the contraband. At the time, I gotta fix this. It says it wasn't clear if it was marijuana or cocaine. I spoke to one of the smugglers. I got a hold of them last summer, and it was marijuana. All the fishermen I talked to would say, "Oh, I heard there was like $1 million cash and dead bodies on that boat," and no one knows because this is the bottom of the ocean. But when I spoke to the smuggler, I asked him point blank, I'm like, "What was on the boat? Were there dead bodies?" He's like, "No." I was like, "Was there a lot of cash?" He's like, "Yeah, there was some cash." He goes, "But it was mostly filled with marijuana. They slept on the bales." And they came all the way from like Colombia, sleeping on bales of marijuana. I mean, he was only 26 when it happened. The scuttling of the boat was a bit extreme, but that's the evidence. So they pulled the plug and it sunk. So there were a lot of rumors that went on about this boat and the powers that be that they didn't want it brought up because the authorities did try to bring it up, but they didn't successfully do it. And they basically got someone on a submarine to try and get it up. And then that guy ended up dead, which is why it's sort of mysterious. This is the submarine. And there's a thing that you guys know, the Fisherman's Voice.
Yeah.
This was from 2010. You can look this one up. If you put the Traveler 3, Fisherman's Voice, you'll find this article. It's a very interesting article where you're like, this is a little weird. And this is the sailboat that they scuttled. And it's a big boat, beautiful, filled with weed. And then this is Harold Jacobson, who was the guy in the submarine that was diving on it, and he's the one that ended up dead. And Sullivan. And it's just a mysterious death where they haven't really quite figured it out. The rumors are that someone didn't want him to be trying to get that boat up, but again, it's rumors. I did speak with his family. I spoke with his niece and two of his nephews, and they all, something's a little weird. He was also a weird guy, but he basically disappeared and left his wallet and his keys, and then they found basically his remains in the woods years later, and there was like a mixed tank. He basically, that they ruled it suicide because they couldn't prove that it was foul play, but it was using mixed tank gas with like a plastic bag kind of thing. Anyway, this was in the paper. What year was this? Oh, this is the Bangor Daily. There was a lot going on that summer. This was in the summer, I think this was June 1978, and the Tusker happened in December of the same year. So 78 was like a big year. The Underwood Canning Company was the year before, so late 70s. The I Forgot was a 51-foot sailboat in West Hillsborough. A crewless boat, as in everyone had gotten out of there. They were seized by the Coast Guard, and there was a hole in the bottom, so they tried to scuttle it. That's the boat right there, dry docked. Where's it? The I Forgot. It is true that I found a lot of this in the Bar Harbor Times on the microfiche machine in the Bar Harbor Library, which is expensive library, but it's not a very nice library compared to this one. So it was really dusty and gross down there, but in the basement, and the microfiche machine was really rough, but I spent quite a bit of time with it. And then the more I looked, the more I found. I mean, there was just all these articles from this time frame. That's the I Forgot. And then the Sunshine was in Turkey Cove in Tennant's Harbor, and they, again, 20 tons, 18.7 tons of marijuana. And there were 9 defendants. And then this is one of my other favorite ones. I love this one. The Ethiopian Coptic Church, because it's just so outrageous. Like that they call it a church, because basically the sacrament is weed. So it's just this religion where they just smoke weed. And they had a compound in Star Island, and 60 Minutes also did a thing on them, and it's hilarious. I highly recommend it, because they're all just sitting around getting stoned, but at the church. Tax write-off or something, I don't know. But they bought a house with a big barn in Belfast, or in Stockton Springs area, to transport the contraband to. The name of the boat was Jubilee, 20 tons. There were 24 people arrested. It was a lot of people. And then with the intent. And this is the court case. And do I have a picture of this? Because it's really funny. Oh, this one made it into the New York Times, by the way. I always think if you make it in the New York Times, you did something right or wrong. And now here it is. Isn't this good? And this one you get Dan Rather instead of Mike Wallace. Yeah, look at how big that joint is. I mean, my God, it's the size of a baseball bat. But anyway, yeah, it's quite the video to watch. I highly recommend it. So those are the ones that I have been aware of, but there's a lot more. So I was lucky enough to, kind of befriend a lot of these people as far as the Coast Guard Gary Moores, and Mike Cuniff shared with me the DEA report about that time frame, and it was really long. To the point where I just was like, oh man, this is way too much. But just to give you a sense, is like, look at how many pounds of marijuana that people were smuggling. See this one, 12,000 pounds of marijuana landed on Mount Desert Island in 1980s. Like, it's just a lot. So I guess what is the point of all this? Is like, it turns out that Maine was a hotbed of drug smuggling in the 70s for sure. And then I think when the war on drugs got kicking, with Reagan, then it winded down pretty quick. Or once Mike kind of got to Maine from New York City, he really cracked down. So what I've done, and again, this is not my day job. I've just done this sort of as a very strange pet project or passion project, whatever you want to call it, is I've interviewed a bunch of fishermen, at least 12, probably more like 20. And I've just gone and showed up where they work or where they live and chatted with them. Most of them have been very forthright, talking to me about the sea hash. A lot of it has to do with the fact that like the statute of limitations is only 6 years for drugs. So it's really like there's not going to get into any trouble. Also, since I started this project, marijuana is legal. Wow. That was not the case in 2011, but now it is. So I don't think people are as scared to talk about it, as they probably were when it was illegal. I took to the Coast Guard, the DEA, the smuggler, one of the smugglers from the Tusker, the Maine State Police, the drug unit, Maine Marine Patrol, that Hancock, Washington County DA, that was Mike Povich. And I spoke to some of the wives and children of the fishermen, the ones that were willing to talk to me about what they thought, and other bystanders, like people who knew about it, people who smoked it, people like that. And then I spoke to 2 people who were busted for buying and selling the hash. So it's been, a lot of people that I've spoken to about it, but it definitely is fascinating to me. My dad told me about this story originally, when I was in my 20s, and I was sort of like, that's really strange. Why would there be drugs in the ocean? Like, it didn't really make any sense to me. And over time, I just became more and more interested. And it's also a really fun way to be in Maine, is like to have a project like this. And also to kind of connect with my roots. So this is my mom holding a baby. I think it's my brother, because there's only one other kid in our family. I don't think it's me. But I grew up here. I love MDI and really just all of Maine, but definitely Hancock County in particular. So it's been a great way to reconnect. This is me interviewing. Actually, this is like the second time I talked to him. This is Bruce Damon, total sweetheart. And I got him to recite Ruth Moore poetry. And he has the most amazing accent, and recorded him doing it. It was pretty great. So it's just been fun, honestly. Had a really good time doing it. I started in 2011. I think that first summer I only interviewed a couple people. And then I got to the Coast Guard and then the DEA. Then I went to Texas in 2016 to interview the smuggler because that's where he lived on a ranch. And he's a really interesting guy. I kind of became friends with him on some level. He's not a smuggler anymore. He is a felon, unfortunately. So I think he can't vote or own a gun, which kind of sucks. But he's now he lives in Montana. Then I went to Coronado to his 50th? Yeah, I think it was his 50th high school reunion. Yes, and I met there was other smugglers there as well, and it was pretty cool. I mean, Coronado's beautiful. I'd never been there before, and I was like, wow, I can imagine your Spanish teacher. Deciding you guys that kind of vibe. I don't know, but it's pretty cool. In 2019, someone wanted to do a docuseries on this, but then the pandemic hit and didn't happen. And then in 2021, I got asked to do a podcast, and we're still working on that. But then I published the article in the Globe, and that's been great because finally the story is out there. If you haven't read the article, I printed some copies. If you want a PDF of it, you can just give me your email and I'll give you a PDF. There's a paywall because it's the Boston Globe, so they got to make their money. But I'm happy to send you a PDF if you want to read it. And the themes in the article or just in this talk is just, again, that this was a hotbed for drug smuggling, marijuana mostly, and hashish. I don't know as much about cocaine and all that other, heroin or oxycontin. I mean, that's the next talk, but definitely for marijuana and hash. Another theme is the have and the have-nots. I mean, I am very aware as someone who came from more of a have-not background, that a lot of fishermen they're just trying to make a living. They're just trying to, feed their families. And that's what a lot of them said to me. It's not like they were really drug dealers or drug smugglers. They're really fishermen, and some of them had an opportunity and they took it, and some people didn't. I don't think that, you can have a moral compass in any way you want, but I think a lot of them were just trying to make ends meet. And it can be really hard to do that here. And I think the fishing industry is getting worse and worse and harder for all kinds of reasons. And most of the people I interviewed are not fishermen anymore, by the way. I think only 1 or 2 of them still fish, and the rest of them are doing other things because the sea is overfished. And, I'm sure you guys know something about fishing, but it's not great. Salt of the earth fishermen, kind of like Bruce Damon, just like people that are really authentic and really Maine, here for generations and generations. Their father was a fisherman, and stuff like that. That was just fascinating to me, to meet people like that were so indigenous, if you will, besides like the Wabanaki or whatever, what I mean, like indigenous as white people, I guess. Criminals versus outlaws, I'm still fascinated by that idea that there is a difference. But criminals are people that are repeated offenders. They're like antisocial personality disorder, people that really have no kind of, they have no empathy. But I think a lot of outlaws are just, people who kind of live a little outside the rules, but they're not necessarily bad people. Morals, that's a big one. When I did publish the article, I got all kinds of really nice comments, but there's always a couple, what do you call them, trolls. And one person was like, I question the moral compass of this article. And I don't know, I don't really have an opinion, to be honest. I just think it's a cool story. I don't feel strongly in any way. I don't think that the fishermen that fished up the hash are bad or that they did anything terrible. And as far as the smugglers, that's a different topic, I guess. But I don't necessarily think that Lee Stripple is a criminal. And I don't know if people would really agree with me there, but if you met him, you would probably agree. I think the legalization of marijuana is fascinating because of how it's reframed this entire story. Because really, it's the same way as you're talking about prohibition. And when you said that, I thought, I might go get a drink after this. And imagine if that was illegal, you know what I mean? And I had to go to some speakeasy in a basement. And now marijuana, which you could, I kind of grew up in the 80s and 90s, people got kicked out of my high school for smoking weed, and now you can go to a store and buy it. It's kind of crazy if you think about it. And for me, this is also about childhood shame versus pride, because I did, grow up kind of hand to mouth on this island with 2 working class parents. And, you know, I think growing up, I always admired people that had money, you know, and I have a PhD now, I make a living. It's been nice to like kind of enter the middle class, if you will. But you know, now I'm kind of looking back at my childhood, and it's like it really provided grit and resilience, and I'm very proud of being, you know, from this island and coming from a working class family, to be honest. But it took me a long time to get there. So that if you want to read the article, it is over there. I did not do any of these graphics, but I thought they were great. They came up with that just based on my description. That's a big brick of hash, apparently. But I thought they did a good job, like making up these fictional fishermen. So, and it was a great, you know, the article, I'm just really happy about it. There's Lee and his daughter. I thought that was kind of cute. And that's the house, the Cutler house. If you go to Cutler, you can go check it out. That's my dad and I in 83 or 4, probably. So feel free to check it out. That's my dad when we lived in Town Hill. He was kind of a hippie, a little bit. Had a goose named Ping, which I think was after that book. And we hung out with my dad hung out with a lot of people in Clam City. Anyone remember Clam City in Town Hill? Someone remembers it. It was interesting. It was where all the clam diggers lived. They're not there anymore. But that was Charlie Torrey. And that was our house in Town Hill. My dad had no pickup truck. And yeah, we had chickens. You know, it's a pretty hand-to-mouth kind of situation. My dad does not fish anymore. He's a carpenter. I am writing, you know, I've been writing a book this entire time. So I'm hoping it'll come out eventually. If you want to keep in touch, you can. I am working with a book agent now, so we'll see if that helps things come along. I'm also working on a podcast, and I was going to kind of to end this, besides questions, let me see if I can do this correctly. Is the thing over here, you guys, yeah. Oh, she has it? Yeah. So this is the sizzle reel, which is what we made for the podcast. It's like a trailer. It's only 4 minutes, but the reason I wanted to play it for you is so you can hear the voices of some of the people I interviewed, which I just love the accents and whatnot. Do I just press play?
Yeah, just press play.
Okay.
The Downeast Goldmine, untold stories of drug smuggling from the coast of Maine. These are tales about sea cowboys, local fishermen, and international drug smugglers. And when a bounty of drugs disrupted an entire region amid furious murder, it's caught in its wake. I'm Audrey Ryan, and back in the 1970s and 80s, when my dad was fishing, Maine was a hotbed for drug smuggling.
It was a time of unlawfulness, there were no police, and people were really crazy about fun.
One night, after returning from grad school, my dad told me about the Tusker, an ocean-going tugboat piloted by drug smugglers who tossed 20 tons of Afghan hash into the cold waters of Cutler, Maine to avoid capture by the authorities.
These guys threw the hash onto one of the greatest scallop beds that I've ever seen.
The people that live on the end of that road, they can hear it splash, splash, splash as they throw it overboard.
I'll never forget the two guys standing in the jail, going scout fishing. These guys are gonna have anything.
I didn't give a shit about it. My crew, you know, they want me just to work on the head. Fuck the skull.
Stuff like fucking science class.
And it was an interview with a lead DEA agent at the time that brought me to the man at the center of it all, Lee Strimple, an operations manager for an international drug smuggling ring that made hundreds of millions of dollars in the 70s.
Here we are in a new environment, we buy the property in the winter of that year, you know, we're already doing a scam, 4 months later.
So your reconnaissance is usually more than 4 months.
Way more than 4 months. It would take us a year to do a scam.
And while fishing for the forgotten stories of the Tusker, I chanced upon yet another oil drug smuggling operation, which occurred 6 months prior. This time, a sailboat called the Traveler 3,
I was a scout, so, you know, Coast Guard watch now, that's good.
So were you on the boat when it was scuttled? Did you actually get in the submarine to look for the Traveler 3?
Well, I found it, it's around there, it's around there, but
But do you think it could be foul play?
I think it's possible. I think he probably had people mad at some people mad at him. Yeah,
Do you mean because of money or?
money, indiscretions, wasn't it? But it's bad, because he was a very complicated person.
The deeper story, though, here is how many people in our region suffer from financial despair, forcing them to wade into the deep waters of heavy moral decisions.
I was trying to feed the family. So next thing you know, you're dealing with this stuff, I'm the one that has to make the rest.
You were dealing with the human beings, they were engaging in this kind of emotional, and unless they made a choice to be aggressive, we were kind.
I didn't like to put my family through, but I didn't know anything.
My uncle on my mother's side, he was a rum and made good money at it. Just like the Tusker, people going to town coves. It was not the first time illegal stuff has come into Capitol. Probably won't be the last.
I'm Audrey Ryan, and you're listening to the Downeast Goldmine, untold stories of drug smuggling from the coast of Maine.
Anyway, that's just a trailer that we did, but I just wanted you to hear the voices of some of the people because they're great. But that's all I got. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer whatever you want to ask me.
You began by saying a lot of stuff came down from Nova Scotia or Newfoundland.
I think she was talking about that. Yeah.
Where was all that coming from? What was all that about?
So that was in 1807 during the Jefferson embargo. And so that was gypsum and plaster and timber coming in from the Maritimes, trying to be shipped down to Boston, New York, and Connecticut, but the Jefferson embargo was blocking off the District of Maine. And so those smugglers were coming in here in the early 1800s.
And I think, I didn't really say this, but I think the weed was coming from, I mean, clearly South America, Mexico, you know, definitely Colombia, but also Thailand. Thai stick was pretty big, and then the hash was more Afghanistan, Pakistan, but not Canada. Yep.
First of all, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
I was just gonna add a couple of things. Turns out, an old friend of mine, he was the attorney for the Coptics.
Oh, no way.
And so he provided me with sort of real-time discussion of this subject.
Yeah.
40 years ago. And it turns out that 20 tons, by the way, keeps recurring is an important number because that's the maximum amount you can put in a semi-truck. Number two.
That makes perfect sense, by the way, yeah.
Was that it was for personal use.
Yes.
And you know, they smoke in base.
Humongous joint.
Right, but then somebody calculated that it was gonna take even them 2,000 years.
I mean, if you do the math, yeah.
And he said that all plants.
Oh, I'm sure.
And the last interesting thing, they actually, I think they come up from like Florida. And
Yeah, Star Island.
Family commune, and it was one of the mothers that moved in to make sure that they ate healthy. And they were always offering him things to eat.
Yeah.
And he was always politely refusing. And
They probably all had the munchies, yeah.
I was well about my friend, they would be to the main street.
Oh, no way, okay. Huh, that's a good side story. Yeah, their compound was in Star Island, which is near Miami, or somewhere in there. And if you watch the 60 Minutes, have you seen the 60 Minutes thing? You gotta watch it, you'd love it. Anyway, go
I
ahead.
just have a couple of questions from the Zoom people. And so how many smuggling operations were successful for the Coronado Company before the Tusker was busted?
So in that house, only 2, but on the West Coast, dozens and dozens. I don't know exactly how many, but I will say I do have some of the DEA, reports, and it's a lot.
Yeah.
Quite a few, but they were indicted a couple times, yeah.
And there was a comment, somebody wanted to know how many outlaws are there in the audience? It might be helpful to know what types of people are attracted to Maine in the first place. Which is an interesting comment, because there's something about Maine, I mean, we, you know, I live in Tremont, we don't really have police, I mean, you know,
Interesting.
it's, you know, it's an interesting thing to think about.
I don't think I can answer that question.
Yeah.
Show of hands.
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
I came in late, so this may have already been discussed. But there's a novel called Midcoast,
Oh, yes, yes.
and that is based on,
Yeah.
in my understanding, they just talk about one family
Mm-hmm.
and how they got into it.
Yeah.
And you don't really know what's going on for a long time.
Yeah.
But it's written by someone who lived in Maine. He actually went to Dartmouth after my son was there. That was the first thing.
Yeah. His name is, I think, Adam White, is that right?
Alan what?
I think his name's Adam White, I think I got it right. It is a good book. I will say this though, it's fictional. It's the fictional book, that takes place in Damerscata, did I say that correctly? Which is the mid-coast, I guess, and it's a great book, and it does address fishing and drug smuggling, but it's fictional. So, but yes, I totally recommend reading it, yep.
Was there any positive economic fallout from the fishermen selling the hash, or did it have pickup trucks or?
Yes, absolutely. New fishing boats, definitely new pickup trucks, at least one house I know of. Yeah, it was a boost. It was a boost to the local economy. I don't think anyone got, you know, rich off of it, but it definitely helped sustain people, and it helped maybe them get ahead. Back when you could buy a house for like 10 grand, you know, there's definitely a house in Bar Harbor that was bought with cash money that I'm aware of. And I've heard about boats and pickup trucks and whatnot. Yep.
So this is my personal question. My grandmother had a summer house in Smugglers Cove, Turkey Cove, in
Yep.
Venice Harbor.
Mhm.
And the house right next to hers was the dock. That, and this was all legend. I didn't actually realize this.
No, it's
was
true. Yeah.
Can you talk of just, my father's on the line right now, so I'm just curious if do you have any details about that are.
That's Turkey Cove, that one in here.
Venice Harbor.
Let's see if that was, I thought I did that one, didn't I?
Yeah, I just didn't know if you had, like. How long was that operation? Did they just purchase the dock, or did they just use that because they built that dock first? Did they just?
A lot of times they bought the house cash, right? Because that's the smart thing to do. Sometimes they rented it for, you know, a year or two, because again, like the smuggler in that clip, notice how he says it took about a year to plan a scam, which is a long time, but they were making a lot of money, obviously. So if you're gonna rent a house, you need it for a while, you know, to pull it off. I don't know, there's a court case on that one for sure. I don't have it in this PowerPoint. But yeah, that was definitely, it's called that for a reason, because that was one of the cases that I believe the DEA busted and told me about. And it happened, yeah, that 1980, that was the tail end, you know, of when this was occurring. But I don't know many more details, but if we Google it, I'm sure that we can get the court case.
And do you feel like did they do sort of recon and sort of have plants, and they had, the kids went to school, and I mean,
Yeah.
it just seemed like any outsider, especially in an insular community like Jonesport or
I know.
Machias, everyone's gonna be like, who's that? You know, the minute they walk in the grocery.
So I think that's a great question, because I think that's the irony of Maine, right? Is that you think, especially back then too, when there's before the internet and cell phones and all this other stuff, is that you think, oh, I'm in this remote part of Maine, no one's gonna notice. Well, actually, there are people that live here and they know everybody, and you're gonna stick out like a sore thumb, right? So, and then, I mean, they had stories. They were actually, I will say the Coronado Company, at least the person I interviewed, very smart person. They did things very meticulously. And, you know, they had caretakers and they had a backstory, you know, they had, you know, I'm sure they were pretty convincing to some people. You know, yeah, there was a lot of recon, yep.
one of the things that seems to stand out, is when it's missing, which is violence.
Oh, yeah.
I'm a little bit surprised, I mean, I only watch fictional things, usually there's guns involved.
Yeah.
But in all every one of these stories, and there's like, 7 or 8 of them, there's no violence, except for maybe that submarine guy, disappeared.
Well,
Is that unusual for marijuana? Is that like a typical thing for marijuana versus cocaine versus heroin?
I think that's a big distinction, is that, a lot of these marijuana people, definitely the Coronado Company and definitely the Ethiopian Coptic Church. I mean, these were peace and love, hippy dippy pothead kind of people. And I don't think that they had guns. And I know for a fact that they didn't have a gun on the Tusker. Like they didn't believe in that. They were not they didn't want to be violent. They weren't violent people. I think, with the Reagan war on drugs, and I think with cocaine and heroin, it's gotten much worse. But, the whole weed thing is kind of like the nonviolent, mostly. I'm sure there were some guns somewhere. Of course, has anyone seen that documentary Murder Mountain? It's about Humboldt County. Ooh, that was a little scary. And they have some guns up there in Humboldt County, but I don't think a lot of these did. Yep. That's a great question. So when I was like, when you think you know everything, I was like, there's like absolutely no woman involved in this story. So I think it was 1 or 2 summers ago, I started calling wives and I said, they knew about it, but they weren't really involved. You know why? They were home raising kids. And, they just weren't, there's not a lot of female fishermen. I mean, there's a few, there's Linda Greenlaw, I don't know, there's not a ton. So they weren't really involved as much, I would say. But yeah, I mean, mostly I was speaking to wives and children too. I spoke to other children of the fishermen and some of them, they had no clue. Because their dad didn't tell them about it, but my dad did, it's probably something they weren't proud of or didn't want their kids to know or whatever. My dad became very forthright at some point and kind of told me everything. And I'm glad he did. At first it was a little weird, but I'm glad he did tell me. But yeah, I don't really have any other woman involved. Well, I would say that the woman Cynthia up in Cutler, she knew everything. She was kind of like the town historian. She had all the gossip. But yeah, there's not a ton of women. It's a pretty male heavy story. Yep.
Will you make a distinction between the people bringing in the drugs, i.e. smugglers, as opposed to like their father?
Oh, definitely.
Who found these things?
Yeah.
These basically like found objects on the side of the road. To call them smugglers is not do justice to.
I don't think of my dad as a smuggler, no.
So when you say smugglers, you don't mean.
No, nope. I'm talking about the people that smuggle the drugs.
Would you consider the smugglers are the criminals and the fishermen are the outlaws?
Yes, except for I've spoken to 2 smugglers for the Tusker and for the Traveler 3, and they're lovely guys. And I don't know them well, but they've never committed any crimes since. They don't strike me as criminals, but again, I don't know. I only know their story, but the fishermen are genuine, like on the whole, just more outlaws. And by the way, some fishermen did not want to get involved in this. They threw it back. I definitely interviewed a couple people, like when I showed a picture of Bruce Damon, probably some of you know Bruce Damon, he didn't want anything to do with it. Bruce Damon's a fisherman, but did he know about it? Yeah, he knew about it. The story that I told in the Globe article, as far as I know, someone went up to his house to use his radio to warn the boats. But he himself wanted nothing to do with the hash because he's more of a just upstanding kind of guy. But some people were like, yeah, I'll make some extra money. I mean, I spoke to one fisherman who said, we didn't think of it as illegal, it was free. I thought it was a really good point, it's like.
How did your dad spend his money?
So, well, my dad, that's a good question. I mean, he never, even though he told me about the hash, he never really told me too much of what he did with it. I think he was friends with other people where they like put it in duffel bags or in like those big buckets and then basically brought it to Massachusetts or whatever. They were trying to sell it out of state because it was worth more money out of Maine. Because Maine, you couldn't get much money for it because there was plenty of it. But if you could get it far enough south, you get more money for it. So he did have, he did, I think, broker some of it. I don't know, what did he do with it? Maybe he did buy a new pickup truck. He never really told me those kind of details. He mostly just connected me with other people that told me stuff, but other people told me about what he had done, because I don't know, I didn't really want to, I think he would share what he wanted to. Mostly he just wanted me to know that this thing had happened, because he thought it was really interesting, and he's right, it was just sort of like bizarre. That's what I always thought, like, how strange is that? Yeah.
How long did Oceanic Research occupy
The canning company? So I think they had it for July, like, when did they buy it versus, so look at these articles, when, I love that sign, man. I wanna, it's just so good. So so August 4th, you'll know when we know. So they successfully did it in July and August. I think they bought it like that spring or something like that. Very short. That was a very well done job. They really pulled that one off well. Through the grapevine, I did speak to someone who told me this crazy story, but I don't want to share it because he never said it really on the record. But he knew who had, captained the mothership and how the whole thing had come to be. It was definitely out of state people, shocking, who brought the marijuana in, but it was, multi-tractor trailer loads worth. It was a lot. And they totally pulled it off, even with the Bar Harbor Times right on their tail. Hey. Any other questions? Well, feel free to keep in touch. If you want the article, I did print out some copies, so take one, or if you want a PDF, skip the paywall, just give me your email. And if you want to know about the book or a possible podcast, if you give me your email, I'll let you know if anything else happens. But thank you for listening.